Because, it's Brother Peter with tidbits from the Word. Because Timothy had totally given himself to the Lord and to his mentor, which was Paul the Apostle, Timothy got to travel with Paul, got to work with Paul, got to do duties for Paul, like carry letters out to Thessalonica and to the Galatians and to different people. And he got to go to all of the countries and the places where Paul did. He got to ride on the ships with Paul. He got to do things with Paul that other apostles and disciples didn't. But also, in a sense of the word, he was Paul's manservant. He waited on Paul and he helped Paul. Paul got to where his eyes were weak when he got older. And because his eyes were weak, he needed a younger man to help him. And Timothy was there to do that. Now, Timothy had much learning from his mother and grandmother, so he knew a lot about different things in the Old Testament. Now let's remember, we said Timothy was from Lystra. Remember, his father was a Greek, his mother was a Jewish woman. That made Timothy a half-breed. But God will use anybody. I don't care who it is. If they'll come to the Lord and follow the Lord, God will use you. It don't matter to him if you have a different colored mama or a different colored daddy than your mama, or mama than daddy. God will use you. Now, Paul had made 2 journeys through Lystra, and the first one he had won Timothy, and the second one he picks him up and takes him with him. He said, you'll be profitable to me, Timothy. So he had wrote Timothy some letters and admonished him and told him different things about godliness and all such. And then he said, evidently Timothy had got to where he was young, and some people that were older than him had complained to Paul and said, this young bird you've sent over here is strutting a pretty good bit. He's strutting around. And Paul said, wrote to Timothy, and he said, don't let the old folks despise your youth, son. And then another thing, Timothy had started running around the block with a society that ran every morning. And Paul had to draw him down on that. He said, hey, son, he said, bodily exercise profiteth little, but spiritual exercise profiteth much. He said, you would do a lot better off to get in the Bible and get your spiritual exercise somewhat, rather than run all day, and take that spiritual exercise to those very people you're running with and tell them what they need to know so they can learn to live too. So Timothy was to be Paul's disciple and his friend and his co-worker, laborer, for the rest of the apostle's life, ministering with him in Rome, ministering with him in Athens, wow, in Corinth, and accompanying him on his trip to Jerusalem. He was with Paul in his first Roman imprisonment and went to Philippi. After Paul's release, in addition, Paul frequently mentions Timothy in his epistle of Romans. in Philippines, in Thessalonians. He mentions Timothy. In Philemon. Paul often sent Timothy to churches as his representative. In 1 Timothy, we find Timothy on another assignment, serving as a pastor of a church at Ephesus. According to Hebrews, Timothy was imprisoned somewhere and released. Now, in those days, when you started following the Lord, you stood a better chance of going to prison than you did going to church. That sounds tough, doesn't it? Why would anybody want to follow a God that got them in prison rather than in church? Because God is real and God is light. And in prison, even though your body be in prison and hung in bars, and even though your body be suffering, your soul was at peace. And that was the difference. His soul was at peace. And because his soul was at peace, he didn't have any problems with it. Now, this was good. What we studied this morning was very good. I'm very happy to have run over it again. And really, to me, it's kind of like the first time. I have to pause. You say, Brother Peter, you talk kind of funny, and you look at words sometimes and you stop and you think about it. And I have to pause sometimes. These are strong words. When I read the word follow, wow. What do you mean follow? How did he follow him? He followed Paul because I've studied it. He went with him. He went with him several places. He ended up in prison with him. And he went with him all the way. He went with him to do whatever he had to do. He did it. He was a servant to him at that time in his life. He met his needs. When he wasn't in prison with him and he was where he was in prison, he was probably the one that carried in the parchment. He was probably the one that carried in the pen he had to use, the pencil. Timothy was probably the one that met Paul's need from the outside in. I worked in a prison for 10 years. I know what it's like to be in there. To not have anybody on the outside that does anything for you. And there are men in there that are that way. They don't hear from their mother, their father, their sisters, their brothers, no friends, nobody. They're in there for years. Not a soul outside cares for their soul inside. Why? Because they've made it that way. They've robbed and stole from their friends. They've broke into their friends' houses. They've eaten their food. They've attacked their children. They've attacked their wives. They've done everything under the sun. And now they're in prison and nobody cares about them. So you have to be careful what you do in this life. Otherwise you can end up in the same place of nobody caring for you. And that can happen to anybody that is following the devil, not the Lord. But we see here that Timothy was secure in his life, that because he had met Brother Paul and because he had followed what he said, that God blessed him, made him have a good life in spite of the fact he was in much tribulation. You know, he was under the same firing line Paul was. If he went out and preached over there in the synagogue, they would want to throw him in behind bars and do the same thing to him they did with Paul. And that can happen with anybody. So what we need to do is we need to be careful. Stay close to the Lord once we get saved. Follow the Lord close.